Hello and welcome back to the second part of The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. I'm Annette Young, filling in for François Picard, who's off for a badly needed week's vacation. Now, normally my guests would be chewing the fat over the week's big stories, but not today, thanks to the US in an extraordinary move, launching those airstrikes in Syria in reprisal for that deadly chemical weapons attack early in the week by Syrian strongman Bashar al-Assad. And it is a stark reversal from the president's formerly standoff approach to the 6-year-old civil war. Now, here to discuss with me the implications of those airstrikes is Christopher Dickey, the Daily Beast foreign editor. Also Vivian Walt, who of course is a contributor and frequent guest here on France 24, but also a contributor to Time magazine. Elena Gabrielian, a RFI journalist, and Rob Parsons, France 24's chief foreign editor. And I want to thank all of you for giving us some of your time and joining us here on the Friday evening. But before we resume our discussion, let's take a listen to what Donald Trump had to say earlier.
Tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking to end the slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, and also to end terrorism of all kinds and all types.
Christopher Dickey, one thing for certain, Bashar al-Assad has nothing to lose now. How are these airstrikes going to impact, if at all, his way of thinking?
Well, all he cares about is keeping himself, his family, and his clans in power. That's what he wants to do. Anything that doesn't directly threaten his hold on power isn't really going to make him rethink much about the way he operates. But I think it's interesting that in that remark by Trump, he talks about opposing terrorism. You know, one of the things that Assad has done is at least use the excuse of, the so-called Islamic State, again and again and again. It's me or the Islamic State, me or the Islamic State. And you talk about how quickly the news changes from one minute to the next. What will happen, for instance, if there's an Islamic State attack here in France or in Europe or in the United States in the next few days or weeks? Well, then all of a sudden, we're going to be back to how do we get rid of Raqqa? How do we get rid of the Islamic State? And Assad will be off the hook again. Some people would say he knows that and is complicit with the Islamic State. That is hard to prove. But it's a possibility. What is easy to prove is that the history of these kinds of interventions, and it's a long one, lots of presidents have done them against a lot of countries, especially in the Middle East. The history is that after almost every one of them, the response has been terrorism of some sort. The classic case is in 1986, the United States bombed the hell out of Tripoli and Benghazi in Libya, and in 1988, the Libyans blew an American airliner out of the sky, Pan Am 103.
Well, this is exactly the argument the Russians have been making, of course, about Syria, that the only way left now, after everything that's happened over the last few years, is to side with the regime, because the regime, for all its faults, and for all the terrible things that it's done, the regime is the only hope of retaining any sort of state in Syria at all. Otherwise, it's total chaos, everybody against everybody, with all the implications that that means for terrorism, for refugees, heading off to Europe and to the United States and other countries. The only chance is the regime. And the curious thing is, until just 2 days ago, we all thought Donald Trump was buying into that. But now he's changed his mind.
The thing is, Vivian, as we were saying before the break, because we have no idea as to what next. And I mean, this is the quagmire, otherwise known as the Middle East. I mean, it creates a vacuum, does it not?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you don't have to go back as far as 1986 to see what exactly might happen. Just let's take 2011, Libya, which the US was somewhat reluctant to get involved in. It was France, really, that led the push for intervention. It was the only time that the West really intervened in one of the Arab revolutions. And it has been, by all accounts, a disaster ever since. And I am not sure that the Libyans have gotten to the point of saying that they'd like Muammar Gaddafi back or that they have nostalgia for those days. But no one could, by any stretch of the imagination, call that intervention any kind of a success. So, I mean, that's very freshly on the minds of military generals and politicians in the US.
The question is not the intervention. The question is the follow-up. What do you do once you've done it? This kind of brings us back to these questions again and again. You know, getting rid of Saddam Hussein was not the worst thing that ever could have happened to Iraq. Saddam Hussein was one of the most monstrous leaders of the 20th century. Fine, that's clear. But for the United States to go in and then not have a viable plan for stabilizing the country, and to hear the Secretary of Defense say stuff happens as everything was falling apart, that's immoral, that's criminal, as a matter of fact.
Well, sorry, go on.
That's why maybe the question, what was the reason of this airstrike? It was just to send a signal to Bashar al-Assad, or it is a signal to start a huge operation. Maybe, as you said, Chris, maybe it was just to send a signal to Bashar al-Assad, because in America we don't really have this plan of some long-term solution of this conflict. We're still in impasse. But it is evident that Donald Trump will really turn the table, because before that, we had since 2012, 2013, Geneva process of negotiations. And then after Aleppo battle, it was in Astana. The city was changed, the actors changed. It was Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Yeah. And today, Turkey condemned also these strikes of Americans and also supported the Americans' operation. So the question is if on the diplomatic table also the actors will change.
I mean, one other thing I think will be interesting over the coming weeks is what the US position is going to be on Raqqa, the Islamic State capital, so to speak, inside Syria.
Well, I was going to say, isn't this by taking a shot at Assad? Is not Trump undercutting his main goal, that being to defeat the Islamic State group?
Well, I mean, what I think is going to be interesting around Raqqa, though, is it had begun to look as though the United States had reached the position where it was ready once Raqqa had been retaken by the Syrian Defense Forces, assuming that happens, which is largely a Kurdish organization, but with large Arabic elements in it as well. The feeling was beginning to grow that once taken, that the United States would be ready to cede that territory conquered from the Islamic State organization back to the Syrian state. But given what has happened over the last 24 hours, I wonder whether that's really going to be the case anymore.
Now, I just want to come back to Elena, because I want to ask you the question. Doesn't this action give Trump an opportunity to demand that Putin either contain or, in fact, even remove Assad? Does it give him extra sort of a one-upmanship in any sort of discussions or talks?
I think that seeing how Russians reacted on what has happened, I think that we could wait some reaction stronger. You know, now we see that only Minister of Foreign Affairs told that we can discuss let's say the diplomatic window open. But as I said at the beginning, for me, it is quite strange why, being aware about these operations, Russians do nothing to protect more the Syrian forces. So that's why, does it mean maybe that they are ready to negotiate about the position of the Syrian power or not?
They're ready to cut their losses with Assad? Who knows?
Who knows?
I mean, Russia is a land of many conspiracies, is it not?
For sure, and we'll see also in Russian media, but not even in the media. Even I think about some deputies of Russian parliament. This morning I heard from one of them that maybe it was a provocation, this chemical attack, to bring Americans again in the Syrian conflict, because it was until now, from the coming to the power, Donald Trump, it was he was perceived like leading a policy of isolationism, and now he is coming back on this in this conflict.
I think it's also really unclear what kind of leverage Trump has over Putin in Syria. I mean, the quid pro quo has to be, you know, if you don't do this, then we are going to, what, get involved in the war? I'm not sure that he's there. And it's really unclear whether or not this was a one-off attack.
Well, no, go ahead. But what you can do is you can make the Syrian expedition more and more costly for Putin.
Mm-hmm.
You can do a better job of funding and building forces on the ground than has been done in the past. You can carry out occasional raids like this that raise the temperature for the Russians and make them more and more and they find it more and more difficult to account for what they're doing in Syria. The more you do that, then the more you have a chance to maybe make some diplomatic initiative. I think, the point of keeping the regime is important. Does that mean keeping Assad? I think it does, but I'm not sure the Russians think that's what it's about. And nobody's in a better position to replace Assad with one of his own people than the Russians.
Christopher, at this point, we're just going to listen to Russia's envoy to the United Nations, who's just been speaking in the last hour or so as the UN Security Council holds an emergency meeting.
We describe this attack as a flagrant violation of international law and an act of aggression. We strongly condemn the illegitimate actions by the US. The consequences of this for regional and international security could be extremely serious.
Rob Parsons, isn't there a risk in Donald Trump in the sense of doing something like this when in fact he has no peace plan at hand? I mean, the last round of American-led negotiations collapsed.
Yes, I think this is the point we were making earlier on, that it's all very well to have a reflex response to something, and he's got a lot of sympathy, not just in the United States, but around the world for what he's done. But one would hope that having done this, that there has been some reflection beforehand about what the consequences would be and how the United States would respond to them. In other words, further down the road, what is the United States going to do? How does it intend to move towards what everybody wants, which is peace? And what does peace mean when you get there? At the moment, there is no indication whatsoever from the United States side, nor for that matter, it has to be said from the Russian side or the Iranian side, about what a peace would look like, how you get there, and what are the main elements going to be? Is it going to be the regime? Is it going to be a sort of bastardized form of the current regime? We just don't know. Nobody's telling us.
Christopher, this action really took everybody by surprise. Who is Trump's go-to person in his inner circle who deals with Syria? Who is he listening to?
Well, one of the people he listens to is a woman who used to be at Goldman Sachs and who is a Middle East hand. But I think in this case, he wasn't necessarily listening to her. I think he was listening probably to Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, just back from Iraq, and maybe even to his daughter. I think the people, and he was certainly, by the way, the Arabs are calling him Abu Ivanka. So, and certainly he was listening to Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, because this really has Mattis's fingerprints all over it. Mattis, we know for a long time, was very resentful of the slow process of targeting, the slow reaction or the non-reaction of the Obama administration. So I'm sure that Mattis went to him and said, we can do this, we can react quickly, let's do it now, let's not hesitate a moment. The sooner you do it, the stronger the message. Whether Mattis has a grand plan for what to do afterwards, I'm not sure.
But it was quite paradoxical because Donald Trump, he criticized Barack Obama when he wanted to start his operation, and he told that he needs to consult Congress. And
so, Elena, you're saying we can hear one thing from Donald Trump in the morning and another thing in the eevening? What a surprise!
I think that's his modus operandi,
Elena taps into something very important, which is that, we're forgetting about the domestic motivation of Trump. And my gosh, I mean, how things have changed in just a day. Here you have the absolute, short, sharp example of, I am no Obama, I'm the tough guy, and don't mess with me. And it was, I think, for relatively low cost, he he gets an enormous bang for his buck.
He gets a fillip, no doubt, in the polls, I'm sure, as a result of this. And Rob, it comes at a time when he's, facing these allegations of his advisors meeting with Russian officials during the election campaign.
No, it's perfect timing for him. His ratings down at 35%, being hit from every side. And this is an opportunity for him to stand out there as being decisive, as being thoughtful, as being somebody who protects children and women, who's standing up to Russia, who invokes God. It's everything. It's classic Trump circus in a way, except that we don't know what the consequences are going to be. The first step has been taken, but I suspect it's only the first step of what could be a long saga.
This is what's called wag the dog, right? Yeah. You declare war and go to war, have one of these sort of military actions, and all of a sudden everybody gets behind you and they say, well, this is stuff we've got to stand together for patriotic reasons, without necessarily thinking through what the consequences.
And of course nobody's mentioned, as far as I know, through today, the fact that he has stopped all Syrian refugees.
Well, this is it.
Coming into the US. And
that's right, all those beautiful babies, they couldn't come to America.
Exactly.
But maybe because through this operation he wanted to show that he makes America great again, but not in his own country, but to show it outside. Because we remember that he wanted to increase significantly defense budget. So, it is like a Chekhov principle. If a gun is hung on the wall, in the first act, in the next act, it should be fired. So maybe it fired in Syria to show that America is great again in this way. So, but I think that the Russians, talking about the reaction of Moscow, too early they opened the bottle of champagne to toast for his victory.
And now they're wondering what next.
But also look at this. The most corrosive element in this Trump administration has been what? Accusations that he's basically a tool of the Russians, that he was elected by Putin, that he's the Putinian candidate, if you will. And now he attacks Russia, has this falling out with...
It's a challenge.
Not Russia. He attacks Syria, has this falling out with Russia, and nobody's mentioning that anymore.
Oh, yes. It's certainly a wonderful diversion tactic, isn't it?
I was just wondering, going back to what we were talking about just a couple of moments ago, Chris was talking about Russia's relationship with Syria and whether the possibility exists of Russia putting pressure or coming to an agreement with the United States on keeping the regime but getting rid of Assad. The fly in that ointment is Iran. And Iran is the one that has the troops on the ground, the big presence inside Syria, and is geographically not that far away. I suspect that even if Russia were to agree with the United States on trying to get rid of Assad, that Iran is already sufficiently strong in Syria to prevent that happening.
Well, Iran's all over the map in that region. One of the things we have to look at is if there's going to be retaliation, if Iran signs on to retaliation for this, they have a lot of places where they can operate. ISIS is not the only terrorist organization. Hezbollah, which has a huge presence, is a terrorist organization. And you've got a very big Iranian presence in Iraq, where there are a lot of American troops now. And there are also 500 or more American troops in Syria.
In Syria.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be surprising to see them targeted by the Iranians.
Now, just coming back, though, domestically to this whole situation and where to next. We've seen, Vivian, recently a shake-up in the National Security Council. Is this a case, given what has happened overnight, that the generals are now back in control, that they're running the show?
It appears to be. It seems over the last few days anyway that Steve Bannon seems to have lost some kind of internal power struggle towards much more professional, military security clique, if you like, who inside the National Security Council, and that would have been obviously critical to giving the go-ahead on an operation like this.
Christopher, you've said Jared Kushner, he listens to Jared. He also listens to his daughter, who tweeted about this attack and how horrific.
He's proud of his father. She's proud of his father.
So I mean, we've started off by this whole program by saying what happens next. We have absolutely no idea. But given your experience, given the length of time you've spent in the region, what are the ramifications in the short term as a result of what happened last night? In short, where do things stand?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of cheerleading over the short term. We've seen it from the Saudis, for instance. But what we're really looking at is a lot of people in the region who want the Americans to end this war. They want the Americans to do something. The fact is, in this kind of situation, it's better not to do something. It's better to stand there and wait and watch and see what's going on. So there's going to be a lot of disappointment in the short term, I think, that the Americans are not going to come in and wave a magic wand or fire 5,000 more cruise missiles or do what they did in Kosovo, 38,000 bombing sorties. That's not going to happen. And when it doesn't happen, all those people who are now praising Trump are going to turn on him again.
Vivian, I mean, just very quickly as we wrap up this discussion, what do you think is likely to occur in the next few days? I know it's anybody's guess, but...
I mean, there's one country we haven't mentioned, which is Israel, which is obviously playing a key role, especially with Jared Kushner there, and who also, obviously, cheered the missile strikes. I think, unfortunately, there is likely to be some kind of nasty retaliation in a place that we don't expect it, perhaps in a time that we don't expect it. As Chris says, there's plenty of actors who could carry that out in any number of places, including against the 8,000 troops in Iraq, 8,000 American troops.
Rob?
Well, I think the ball's in Assad's court now. The focus of international attention is on Assad. What's he going to do next? Trump is concentrated in a way he's never been before on what's happening in Syria. Assad has done many awful, awful things before he gave the go-ahead for this chemical weapons attack. He is almost certain to carry on doing the same sort of things in the future. Is the United States' attitude to the sort of atrocities he's been committing in the past going to change over the next few weeks, or are we going to revert back to type? I've got a feeling that there's going to be a lot more pressure on Trump to take decisive action.
Unfortunately, I'd love to hear what you have to say, Elena, but I'm going to have to wrap up this conversation because absolutely, it's time now for Media Watch. And it's time now for Media Watch, and I'm joined here in the studio by Diptyka Laurent. And Dipty, you've been looking at reaction on social media to Trump's decision to launch those airstrikes.
That's right. A lot of reactions, and this decision has left no one ambivalent, that's for sure. And it comes with very awkward timing. Donald Trump was, of course, preparing to woo the Chinese leader and hopefully gain some common ground with him when this decision was made. In fact, Bloomberg says he went from steak dinner to situation room, and says that as he was complimenting Xi Jinping's wife, the U.S. military were preparing to fire cruise missiles into Syria. And the reactions, of course, have been coming in hard and fast. A lot of support coming from his critics, interestingly, people saying it was proportional, appropriate, just. We had Marco Rubio, who was very vocal on it, and he said that he actually tweeted a proverb showing his approval, saying the wicked will not go unpunished, while Senator John McCain and Lindsey Graham also released a joint statement essentially saying that Trump confronted a pivotal moment in Syria and he took action on it. And, of course, the international community, barring Iran, China and Russia, of course, the president of the European Commission, Donald Tusk, who tweeted this earlier, his support for Donald Trump. Now, on the flip side, a lot of Trump's right-wing allies, especially the sort of hardline right-wing supporters, are furious. They're furious because, first of all, he didn't seek congressional support on this decision. You had Republicans like Ted Cruz who've taken him to task on this. And Rand Paul, a Republican senator, wrote this in Fox News saying, no president is above the law or above the Constitution. I said so when it was Obama, and I will say so when it is Trump. So you're sort of seeing a lot of the Republicans really angry over this decision. In fact, a Twitter user, Matt Stoller, has been tracking all the Breitbart responses to the decision. He says there were 8,000 in several minutes, and he's been retweeting them. Some of them saying, well, Trump has a lot of explaining to do. Others saying he's been set up by false intelligence. Others are furious at what they call a complete upending of Trump's foreign policy on Syria, something that many people voted for Trump because of. And he obviously previously condemned any military action in Syria. So a lot of people taking note of that. I just want to show you one tweet from a Breitbart comment feed. President Trump folded in less than 100 days. Steve Bannon might as well leave now and come back to Breitbart to supervise the coverage of World War III. Maybe a bit dramatic, but certainly you get the idea of what people are saying. Now, just finally, there's this op-ed from from Anthony Blinken, who was Obama's national security advisor, and he's written a really interesting article saying something that you were discussing earlier. Where do you go from now? Like, Trump has made it clear what his intentions are in Syria. Where do we go from now? Well, he says he needs something that's been lacking in this administration so far, and that's smart diplomacy.
Okay, and on that point, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all of my guests and for joining us here on The World This Week, and that's it from this edition. Coming up next is Tom Burgess-Watson with the day's headlines and news. Do stay with us here on France 24.